and he can speak third anyway, so just let him sort himself out. Good afternoon and welcome to Frontline. Thank you very much for coming to this. Kevin, come and join us for this event. I'm David Loyne. I'll be chairing the next hour, and we want to finish reasonably promptly because the speakers have planes to catch. And if I could just remind you that this event is being recorded by Frontline to be podcast or streamed later. And so when it comes to questions, if you could just wait for the microphone to come round, and if you do have some affiliation, it would be courteous to share it with us when it comes to that. If I could just start with a personal note and a tribute to my friend Henry Worsley, who some of you may have heard of, who died 30 miles short of a 1,000-mile trek across the Antarctic. He was aiming to be the first man to cross the Antarctic unassisted, and he was an ex-soldier. I got to know him in Afghanistan. In fact, he was the first commander of British troops in Afghanistan in 2006, and an extraordinary British adventurer. And there was no subject closer to Henry's heart than giving young people the chance to achieve in life. He was someone who raised money for a variety of charities, allowing young people to achieve their full potential. And I think he would be keenly, if we could just turn off the mobile phones, Henry would be keenly interested in the outcome of the event that we're here today and the events that the speakers are looking at later on in the year. And it's a very rare event at Frontline where I have to say that genuinely the speakers on the platform need no introduction. Two very distinguished public servants from their own country, both leaders of respective Labour parties and of course Prime Ministers of their country. And on my right, Kevin Watkins, who is one of Britain's foremost experts in international development, has specialised in education and now heads the Overseas Development Institute. So if I could start with the former British Prime Minister, Gordon Brown. Gordon.
Well, can I say, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here this evening, particularly with Gillard, the former Prime Minister of Australia, who has not only been a distinguished political leader in her own country, but is now leading the Global Partnership for Education and making major improvements in the way we deal with education globally. And it's a real pleasure to be with you, Julia. We're both recovering politicians, you might say. And Kevin Watkins, who is not only the head of the Overseas Development Institute, but has been instrumental in moving forward some of the things we're about to talk about this evening. And if he leaves urgently, it's because his wife's just about to have a baby. And I thought he was being prevented from coming onto the stage because of that. I'm very pleased to speak with Julia for another reason. The first time I did a media interview on foreign affairs after I became a member of Parliament, I was asked by Gerald Kaufman, who was then our foreign affairs spokesman, who you may know of, and this was the 1980s. He didn't want to bother staying around to do a radio interview with a programme down under as part of his international remit, and he asked me, as a new member of Parliament, to take over from him. And he gave me these instructions. He said, at 10 o'clock, because of the time difference, that's when they're going to phone you for a morning programme down under. You just be at the phone, the people will ring you, you'll go straight through to the studio. And I sat there for my first great international radio interview, and the phone rang. I picked it up. They said, we're putting you straight through to the studio. The interviewer said, Mr. Brown, you're from the British Labour Party and you're trying to reform your Labour Party. You're the new Labour Party and we here, we're just stuck in the mud, is that right? And I said, no, not at all. And I started stupidly to name drop. And I said, I've just met your Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, last week. And the Australian Labour Party is as modern as the British Labour Party. He said, Mr. Brown, you're talking to Radio Auckland. This is, this is New Zealand. Our Prime Minister is David Longing. And I thought my political career was actually over. I've never made the mistake between Australia and New Zealand again. So I want to talk to you this evening about something that I think is becoming the central issue in both international development and foreign affairs. The huge, momentous refugee problem that now arises from what's happening in Syria, and of course is a problem now right across the Middle East because of what's happening in other countries. And what we, the Global Education Commission that Julia and I are both on, but what we, in my position as UN envoy, can actually do about this. I think you all know the figures. There are 60 million displaced people around the world, 30 million of them children, and it's children I want to talk about this evening. There are 20 million refugees, and there are 10 million of them children. Out of Syria, there are 12 million displaced people, 6 million, just about half of them are children. And when you look at the children in the vicinity now of Syria, who are in Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan, here we have a concentration of 2 million children, 2.5 million probably by the end of the year, are growing at a rate of about 5,000 a week, leaving Syria, but on the streets, desolate, in huts, hovels, tents, shacks, not most of them in camps, but outside in terrible conditions in these three countries. And the question is, what are we going to do about this? And that's why the London conference is taking place on February the 4th. It's the 4th UN conference. Ban Ki-moon is coming from the UN, and I'm with him on this. And the issue is, why, after 5 years of this civil war, is the fate of these children not being dealt with and addressed? Why is education for these children in particular falling completely through the net? Why are most of them still out of school, on the streets? And why are they vulnerable, as has happened, to child labour, child marriage and child trafficking without the world doing enough about it? We know that the rates of child labour are now high, and because adults are prevented from working in these countries, they're using children under the radar to give families an income. Girls Not Brides says the rate of child marriage has actually doubled in the area, because Syrian girls coming out of Syria who would have automatically been at school are now being married off because families think that that is a safer way for them to survive, and child marriage is becoming a huge problem. But we know also that because of the way the humanitarian system operates in the world, that even if you had a child who was out of school for 10 years, it is unlikely that they will have education. 25 million children out of school in conflict areas now, and in this region we have to show whether we can actually do something about a problem that is not just big, but is growing and is bound to continue to grow. And basically what happens is humanitarian aid primarily will go to food and shelter, and that's obvious that that's bound to happen. Development aid is long-term and cannot deal with a crisis, and people push them back to humanitarian aid, and schooling for these children, just as healthcare does, falls completely through the net. And now we have what is rightly called the lost generation. If you want to slow the exodus of families to Europe, you would want to do something about the provision of facilities for families and children in the region, and you would be investing in education. If you want to do something about child marriage and child trafficking and child labour, the most effective way we know to do something about it in any part of the world is to get these young people, in particularly girls, into school. And if you want to do something about extremist influences benefiting from this discontent that is bound to arise when young people are on the streets, then you'd want to do something about education. And we know the average time that a refugee is out of a country where there is a crisis is 10 years. And so it's likely that almost that many of these school children will never see a classroom through all their school age years. So what we've done over the last year is carry out a pilot. Kevin is here partly because he designed this pilot. And in Lebanon, through the education minister's brilliance, we have managed to get 200,000 children into schools, almost from a standing start of nothing. And these 200,000 are in what is called double shift systems. So in the morning and the early afternoon, the Lebanese children are taught mainly in French and English, The same school classroom is used for later in the afternoon and early evening. Because the refugees are dispersed across the country, they can use different schools, and there's 250 schools now being used for this, and we've got 200,000 kids into education at the cost of only $500 per child. We can expand this to 1 million, and we are planning to do this over the course of this year. And our target is to raise sufficient money, $750 million, so that for the whole of the year, 1 million school places can be provided, not just in Lebanon, but in Turkey and in Jordan. And so at the London conference, I'm demanding and calling for, and all the international organizations are now supporting this, that there be 1 million school places financed, and we could quickly double the number of double shift schools in Lebanon. We have got an agreement that Turkey will move to do this in the next few months if they have the money, and Jordan will double their numbers from 100,000 to 200,000 who are in school, also in part using the double shift system, and that is the way that for a cost-effective amount of money you can actually transform the prospects of young people in the region. I had a young kid when I was in Beirut a few weeks ago, and you ask, as you do, but well, maybe it's just politicians that do, you keep asking kids, what do you want to do when you grow up? What do you want to do when you finish school? And this guy said to me, he said, I want to be an engineer. And I said, engineer, because it's not usual, because most people want to be pop singers or pilots. And he said, engineer. He said, yeah, I want to go home and rebuild Syria. And the idea that these kids are desperate not to go back to their home country, and that they're somehow going to be benefit seekers in Britain and Europe. They want to go back to their country, they want to do something for the country, and whereas we take it for granted that we will have our children at school, they want themselves to fight for the right to go to school. So what do we plan? And this is where I'll finish. 1 million school places for children in that region, to prove as a test case that this can be done in any humanitarian conflict. If it can be done in these troubled areas, it could be done elsewhere. To establish the right of every single child to education, irrespective of their borders, irrespective of nationality, in every part of the world. To create a humanitarian platform for education in emergencies, so that whether it's South Sudan or Boko Haram in Nigeria, or whether it's Pakistan-Afghanistan border, or whether it's Iraq, that we will be able to guarantee over time that every single child in the world, whether you are in a conflict zone or not, you're neither going to be in a school that's militarized, you're not going to be recruited to be a child soldier, schools are going to be protected places, and every young person should have the hope, the chance of education. And it comes down to the central fact that education can provide opportunity, education can be about social cohesion, but for these kids, and for many kids in other places around the world, education is the one thing that gives them hope, that they can prepare and plan for a future, that they can actually set out a course of action that may lead to them having a qualification. And if we can't give them education, we cannot give them hope. And in the next few days, leading up to this London conference, I'm going to be doing speeches and other events to make sure that people understand that we have a huge opportunity here in the gravest humanitarian set of crises since the Second World War, with a huge number of children in particular in need and in difficulty, to provide not just for their food and shelter, which is basic, but to give them hope for the future.
Thank you very much indeed, Gordon. Bearing in mind that not only is there this London conference at the beginning of February, but later on this year there's another international forum looking at protracted crises, not just Syrian education. The London conference is about funding Syria, but looking at protracted crises, and why education falls through the net is the concern of this International Commission on Education that Gordon Brown is leading this year, and one of the members, Julia Gillard, also chair of the Global Partnership for Education. Do you think that you can really change minds of all these world leaders later in the year in order to get education higher up the agenda?
Yes, I do. I'm an optimist on that. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Gordon for his persistent advocacy and leadership. He's talked to you about what's been done so far, and I think we'd all quickly come to the conclusion that much more needs to be done. But the fact that arrangements have been made for 200,000 Syrian children, a lot of that credit for getting that done is due to Gordon and his persistent work and advocacy, and I think we should acknowledge that. I am absolutely of the view that global minds and global leaders are now more focused on education than they have been in the past. The Syrian crisis, I think, has focused minds. Yes, there is so much more that needs to be done, and the London conference is a pivotal moment, but I think there is an understanding that Syrian children have been used to going to school. One of the great tragedies here, and I acknowledge the work of Brookings, the Brookings Institute had done a study about comparative education standards in the Middle East. The data set it was relying on was one before the Syrian war commenced. And when you look at that diagnostic of learning standards, what it tells you is that the Syrian school children used to go to a high-performing school system by the standards of the region. So these are children that were used to going to school, would have been going to school with some aspirations, some hopes about their future, and now all of their lives have been changed and cast into uncertainty, conflict. They will have seen horrible things, experienced dreadful things, and amongst their many losses is that daily engagement in learning and that sense of hope for the future. So I think that that has galvanised attention. I think the world's attention has also been galvanised through tragedy on girls' education, the shooting of Malala, what has happened with Boko Haram, the increasing evidence that girls' education is a transformative change agent, not only for that individual girl, but also for her family and her community. I think that there's more energy around trying to do more for girls around the world than there has been in the past. And then, through the work of bodies like the Global Partnership for Education, which I'm privileged to chair, we are able to demonstrate in some of the poorest and indeed most conflict-affected places in the world that you can engage, that you can make a difference, that you can lead to better educational planning, better educational delivery, get kids into school and get kids learning. And so we've been involved in places like South Sudan, the Central African Republic, the DRC, Yemen, Afghanistan, the list goes on. And we are able to show that through that engagement, school systems are better planned than they were, better resourced, and are more focused on learning outcomes and equity. But we need more resources to get this work done around the world. Urgently, more resources for the Syrian children, but urgently too, resources for children who have been displaced through other conflicts. Many of them people displacements in quite large numbers that don't strike our headlines because they're people displacements in Africa. But we need to make sure that those children who are being forced across borders for various reasons also get the benefit of a continuity in their education. And then in so many parts of the world we need to invest so that children get to go to school and standards are lifting. If I can leave you with one statistic on how big this task is and something that should galvanise our attention and make us want to do more for the future. At current rates of change, it won't be until 2111 that the world first sees a generation of sub-Saharan African girls who universally go to primary and lower secondary education. That means no one in this room will live to see it. That means we are talking in that 100-year time horizon, not about achieving education as we know it for sub-Saharan African girls, but the equivalent in Australian terms of going to the end of year 10 and then leaving school. It's too long to wait. It's a ridiculously long time horizon. And it will take more resources and more global efforts if we are to change that time horizon so that we are seeing those girls get an education and get a chance. So there is a great deal to do, but I do come to this, campaigning with a real spirit of optimism. I think that there is more energy and more momentum now. Gordon really does deserve a great tribute for having catalysed a lot of that. Now is the time to use that campaigning energy to drive the rest of the way for the outcomes we need to see for the children of Syria and the children of the world more generally.
Thank you very much, Julia. Well, if you want to see the consequences of failing in education in conflict zones, go to Afghanistan, where I've spent a lot of time, and over the last 30 or 40 years there's been until the last 10 years or so, very, very poor educational standards. And of course, it's very easy for the conflict to continue because the lack of educational aspiration across rural Afghanistan remains very high. Is there any evidence, Kevin, that in the last now with Syria as the problem that the world's facing, that we're going to learn the lessons that we didn't learn in Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s?
Well, I think thanks to the efforts of Gordon and Julia, we're in a much better place on Syria than we would otherwise be. But if I could just take a step back, if I may, that actually when Gordon asked me to go to Lebanon initially, I spent a week in the Bekaa Valley. And 2 days of that week I spent with a young girl and her brother. The girl her name was Aisha, and she was 14. She'd had one brother killed in Ghouta, actually, which is, as many of you will recall, was subject to a gas attack on the civilian population. Her father had been killed. She'd come to Bekaa with her younger brother, who was 8, and they were living in a garage with a grandmother. And the thing that struck me, there's something incredibly sobering about speaking. So she was in primary school in Syria, about speaking to a young 14-year-old with her brother, who can't go to school, and and there's nobody out there, there was nobody out there batting for them. There were lots of studies going on, lots of idle chit-chat in the international community, but nothing was actually happening. And the good news is that we're now in a situation in Lebanon where we've gone from enrolment of about 60,000 to over 200,000 in the space of 2 years. That's really largely down to the advocacy work that Gordon has done with the Minister of Education in Lebanon and other UN agencies and the GPE who have supported it. And it both demonstrates what is possible and I think invites us to hang our heads in shame at what we've allowed to happen. The fact that it's taken an entire primary school generation to stop sitting on our hands and do something in a country, with a government that's committed to act, that actually takes relatively small amounts of money if you do it through a double shift system. And yet we've done so little for so long. And in that period, as Julia outlined, this is a statistic that I find shocking. 4 years ago, Syria, an average Syrian kid, had the same prospects of getting through primary school as a kid in a high-performing middle-income country like Thailand. They had a 70% chance of getting into secondary school. In the space of a single generation, they've gone to education indicators which are close to Sierra Leone. They're down there with South Sudan. Now, if you try to, think of your own lives, if you lived in a country, that there is no precedent for this, and if you destroy the hope and the opportunity that comes with education that quickly and on that scale, it has huge social consequences. And actually, you can see those consequences in streets across the region. There's an epidemic now of child labour. So these are kids who have been denied an opportunity for education. They're forced into labour markets. They're forced into early marriage, which is a travesty and a violation of their basic rights. And it's also a reflection of the growing poverty that we're seeing among refugee populations. And when these, you often look at UN appeals and you register the numbers of the shortfalls. And so last year, only around half of the appeal for Syria was met. And you register the 50%. What you don't think of is the food shortages, the restrictions on health opportunities, the restrictions on education that come with that deficit. And so I think the London conference, is a real opportunity to start changing that picture. But it's not going to happen automatically. And, Gordon is right. We're releasing a report next week in the Overseas Development Institute, which is based on interviews with Syrian refugees coming in to Europe, including focus groups discussions with women. And, I invite you to reflect on the obvious question of what is the thing that the mothers of the children who are accompanying them on this very hazardous journey to Europe, what is the one thing they really prioritise? They're moving because it's their only chance to get an education for their kids. Now, you don't want this to play out as this is a way of keeping them in the region and that sort of thing. That Europe needs to be doing far more to support refugees who are coming into Europe. But if you're serious about giving people a chance to rebuild their lives, you have to provide an opportunity for education. If I may, there's one very brief point I wanted to end on. 20 years ago this year, a very close friend of Gordon's, Grassa Michel, wrote a report on the plight of children caught up in conflict. And it's a harrowing report, and I suggest everybody in this room goes to read it. She has a sentence in that report where this was in 1996, where she said, it's difficult to imagine greater depths to which humanity can sink when you look at the violations of the basic rights and freedoms of children caught up in conflict. I'd invite any of you to look at what is going on in the region. The indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas, including schools in Yemen. Indiscriminate attacks on children across Syria. And it strikes me that as part of this, and that the London agenda does talk about protection as well. But we have to end this culture of impunity of people who are conducting these systematic attacks on children. Yeah. They deserve something better. And I think now is the time to stand up for their rights.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. I mean, Gordon, Kevin mentions what you've done as the UN's special envoy on education. What difference will the Commission make? I mean, what difference will this year make? I mean, if you were now the Chancellor of the Exchequer of a country facing austerity,
they wouldn't allow me. Would
you be giving more money to organisations like this?
Yeah, you know what they say about finance ministers. There's only two kinds of finance ministers: those who fail, and those who get out just in time. And, so, not being now a finance minister, I would say that the purpose of our Education Commission, and Julia's mentioned some figures, is to alert people to the fact that if you make promises, such as the international community did in September, that every child will be guaranteed not just primary but secondary education by 2030, you've got to find a way of delivering. Because what is worse now than people growing up in developing countries and being told that a promise was made and it is not being delivered, and that itself is a recipe for massive discontent. So what we want to do is to chart forward what are the needs of education over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And we found already that the chances are that despite our promise that 100% of boys and girls will be in education in sub-Saharan Africa in 2030, only a third of them will be in secondary education in 2050. So for all the promises we made, we haven't put up the funds. And so we're going to look at how we can actually finance the development of education over these next years, so that we can indeed be the first generation when every single child can go to school. We have never been able to say that this generation can guarantee that every single boy and girl in the world will have the right to go to school. We must become the first to do it. So that's what we're charting. One of the starting points, however, is what we're talking about this evening, that half the children who are out of school in the world are in conflict zones. And they are not only, as Kevin has rightly said, out of school, their protection, their safety is an issue if they're on the streets. It's now said it is safer to be a soldier in a conflict zone than to be a girl, because of the risk of child marriage and child trafficking and child labour. So one of the first things we've got to do is to make sure we have some provision so that in future people will simply not fall through the net and go through their whole school-age years without ever entering a classroom. So our aim is to universalise provision of education, to find a means of funding it, and to deal with the most urgent situations with recommendations that will make sure that in a conflict zone we at least make every attempt possible to give a child education.
It's not just about numbers of children in school, though, Julia, is it? It's also about the quality of the education itself. I mean, I've been in schools in Africa where the teachers have only primary school education themselves, and so the levels of improvement of teaching staff and all the rest of it are part of a much bigger picture than just funding schools, aren't they?
Yes, they most certainly are, and so the statistics are that there are 121 million children of primary and lower secondary age who are out of school. There are 250 million children who get access to some schooling, some of them 4 years or more of schooling, but still can't do the most basic literacy and numeracy tasks. So they haven't learned to read or write or do mathematics. And that has to cause us all to ask the question, well, you know, is there a great deal of point in having kids go and sit in this thing called a school if they aren't doing any learning? We've got to address that, and one of the aspects of the Sustainable Development Goal agenda is to not only put the focus on access, do kids have a school to go to, but also on learning. Are they going to school and learning? And absolutely pivotal to that is the quality of teaching. In many nations where we're trying to improve education systems, there are nowhere near enough trained teachers. That requires us to think in different ways about how a teacher can be supported with lesson plans and other professional supports to deliver education in a systematised kind of way. It's requiring the Commission that Gordon is leading and I'm serving on to think about what are some of the breakthrough models that might be able to be scaled up and rolled out in some of the poorest places on earth. We are, obviously, when we're thinking of a school, all of our minds run back to our own school days. So you imagine the classroom and you imagine the teacher in front of the classroom, and depending on how old you are and when you went to school, you might imagine 40 kids in that class or 30 kids in that class. That can't be, isn't, in the modern age, the only way of providing school education. And so I think there are some step changes that we need to investigate, which can be rolled out, which will give quality, access, and will enable us to cut those 100-year time horizons for getting universality.
But are we going to get the money this time, Kevin? I mean, if I could take you out of your sort of consultant to the Commission hat and put you in your ODI hat as someone that you've worked for Oxfam before, you've someone who's watched this over several decades. What difference do, frankly, ex-heads of state make to people now making decisions? I mean, as you point out, less than half of the money for Syria that the UN wanted last year was actually raised by, you know, cash-strapped governments facing austerity and facing newspapers and news organisations in their own countries saying we shouldn't spend any more money on all these people abroad.
Well, I guess as the only non-former Prime Minister on the panel, I'm uniquely equipped to answer that. You know, I think what is possible, you know, it's not a function of the financing gaps, it's a function of the political will and the mobilisation and the campaigning and the advocacy. And you know, if we were having this discussion on health in 1997, where there was no global fund for vaccines, there was no global fund for HIV/AIDS, and you look at the extraordinary gains that the creation of those funds delivered, you know, saving millions of lives, and the success of those funds mobilised and galvanised new and additional resources. So we've seen a big increase in aid for health. Unfortunately, in the case of education, we've seen it flatline and actually started to drop over the last couple of years in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. Now, you know, I think the big question is that you have to ask the governments who signed on to the Sustainable Development Goals, are you serious? Because at current levels of funding and with the current systems that we have in place, there is no prospect, zero prospect of achieving the 2030 goals. And you can't wait for 5 years on this. So, you know, either we do it now, and, you know, I think we know roughly what the financing gaps are, around 20 billion. We know we need to harness additional financing to better systems for training teachers, systems for making sure that kids don't go into school having been malnourished, better systems for accountability in the education sector. Yeah, think of London schools. I mean, 20 years ago, these were sinks for failure in poor areas of London. We've seen a transformation. Now, you know, things can change with the political will, and I think, you know, the job that Julia is doing and Gordon is doing, you know, is shifting the political goalposts, if you like, and I think it's challenging political leaders to raise the level of ambition in a way that's consistent with what they said they're going to do.
But of course, it's not just about governments, is it, Gordon? I mean, those big global funds also engaged private sector money. Is that something that could be engaged in education? Are you looking for a global fund for education, something that dramatic?
Well, if you think of humanitarian aid, it is almost ridiculous to think that when you're in a desperate need, it's only the public sector that's going to contribute. We need foundations, we need charities, we need philanthropists, we need businesses to make their contribution to humanitarian aid. And it's strange to think that when you are dealing with the issue of humanitarian aid, we have not coordinated all the different sectors in making them all ambassadors for raising money and creating new resources. As far as the future of education is concerned, most people assume that education is principally paid for by government. The reason that health, I think, has taken off in a way that education has still to capture the imagination. I mean, clearly when you see lives about to be lost and you see terrible physical suffering, people want to act, and therefore it's more likely that people are going to give money. And I can understand that, and it's the right thing to ask people to give money when there is ill health, and when there's the threat of death, and when there is the terrible scourges of malaria and AIDS and tuberculosis, things that we can actually do something about. So in the last 20 years, as has been said, there's been a global fund created for health. There is global philanthropy. I mean, Gates is well known, but there's many people who have been attracted to giving money for health and so on. And there have been governments that have actually led, principally now America, leading in being a multilateral partner in forcing through more funds for health. And that's why Gavi is funded to about 5 billion. The Global Fund is about 13 billion over 3 years. They have an enormous amount of extra funding as a result of decisions of the world community. And these things have still to happen in education. Julia runs the Global Partnership of Education, but she will be the first to say that she needs substantially more resources. And the scale of the funds available to the Global Partnership are a fraction of what is available to the Global Fund and the Global for Health and the global vaccines. We need to find other governments who are prepared to take this up. I mean, I think it's true to say that both Julie and I tried to make our governments pro-education in the global development sphere, but we need more. We need other governments to take up the multilateral cause, and we need to find philanthropists and foundations. The interesting thing is that people are prepared to give money for schools in their own country, but when it comes to global education, very little. In a sense, in health, people are prepared to give money globally for health in a way they're not prepared to give money globally for education. So we have got to create this environment. It comes down to this, you know, it's said you can survive for 40 days without water, 8 days without food, 8 minutes without air, but you cannot survive for a second without hope. And it comes down to this question. Education is about giving people skills. It is about giving young children opportunities. It is about building social cohesion. It is also about mutual understanding developed in the school curriculum between children. But I think it is principally, we've got to argue that you cannot have anything other than a lost generation unless you can give these young people hope. And education is the way to do that.
I'll turn to the floor. There's a roving microphone. If you could just first here, and then you, sir. And I'll take three actually, and then I'll go through them across the panel. The first three I saw were you, sir. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Marie Collins. I work with Christian Aid. I'm the program officer for Syria and Lebanon. It was great to hear. I think everybody referred to the need to have girls in particular recognised that they have been blocked more from education in this crisis. I just want to raise the point that in terms of the double shifts, I was speaking recently to one of our partners in Lebanon that works specifically with women and girls in the Bekaa Valley and in Beirut. And she raised the point that all of the girls they've spoken to speak about education being an absolute priority for them. But that because of the shifts and because the classes for Syrians are in the evening, that many girls are unable to access the classes because it's seen as an issue of protection by their families and they won't allow them to access the classes. So I just wonder to what extent this would be taken into consideration.
We're doing something about this already. I mean, transport to schools and safe transport to schools. I mean, you will have to run double shifts because you cannot cater for the children without new buildings, which will take a long time without using double shifts. But you can ensure that there is safe transport to schools, there is nutrition meals provided at schools, and it's to build up the infrastructure of these schools, the transport and everything else, that some of the money that is being raised in London will be directed. So I can assure you that is a well understood problem, and particularly, of course, in rural areas where children are having to travel some distance to school. You've got to guarantee safety. Safe schools is actually something that is a very important concept now, because we have assumed that schools are safe havens without doing anything about it. You've got to make the schools safe in Nigeria as well as in Lebanon, and you've got to make sure that girls feel that it is safe enough for them to go to school.
Thank you.
If I could take that, you and you. Just take a couple of questions together.
Well, again, congratulations to the initiative. My name's Bob Moon. I'm Professor of Education at the Open University here in the UK. And my question really is, to what extent have you really thought about integrating technologies into the initiative? And to what extent could you be thinking about developing open schooling systems? There are some good examples of open school systems around the world.
See, that's technology doing really well there.
And you, sir? Yeah.
My name's Adam Leather. I'm chairman of Planet Biodiversity, which is involved in projects in Sierra Leone. I want to draw attention really to a leading nation in education, firstly, which is Norway, which funded and has got a $1 trillion supranational fund, which is fabulous, based on oil and a 78% tax on oil. Interestingly, we had a report called Equity for Extractives, which was produced 3 years ago in May of 2013. This talked about the balance between the need for many areas of development, including education, and the natural resources that many of these extremely poor countries have in terms of education by comparison to the natural resources which are drawn very often for profits to offshore tax centres and places like that, without any statewide capability of development. And something needs to be done by the governments of the world, which can be done to follow up on that Equity for Extractives report, to balance out the obligations of developing companies in those countries. What can I say about those kind of initiatives?
Okay, Julia, so if you could pick up the question of technology. I mean, you talked about the image that we have of schools not necessarily today, not necessarily being the right one. I mean, is open learning something that schools should go for?
I think there is the possibility for technology to make a real difference, but the landscape of many developing countries' education systems is littered with failed technology projects because how to integrate and plan it hasn't been properly worked through. So I know from my own personal experience that you'll go to schools where some philanthropic person, often with a tech background, thought that they would help, but because these schools are beyond the reach of electricity and connectivity, their vision was never going to come true. So one of the things I think we've got to think about at the Financing Commission is some of these breakthrough solutions, but in terms of their deployment, it's always going to require good planning. And the essence of what GPE does is we work with our developing country partners in a genuine partnership to help schooling plans be drawn up. Many of the countries in which we work have never had an education sector plan, never had a plan for schooling. So until there's engagement and a robust plan against which people can mobilise and then understand the backdrop against which they're working, you're always at risk of big errors being made. So I think the answer is yes, but there is this but piece of proper planning. If I could just very briefly say something on the extractive industries piece. I think it is incredibly important. Whenever you look at any of the statistics for education, overwhelmingly the funds for education come from domestic governments. And for many domestic governments, until they've got robust taxation systems, you're always going to be running behind the curve of need because they haven't got enough revenue to deploy. So having appropriate taxation arrangements, including for extractive industries, I think is part of the solution.
Gordon.
Yeah, I was going to say on our commission is not only Jack Ma of Alibaba, but a number of technology experts, including the guy who's running the EDU-X at Harvard. And in theory, it ought to be possible that the greatest libraries of the world should be, and the greatest teachers of the world could be accessed by the poorest and most remote areas in the world through modern technology. And so we're going to have to look at that and how you can get information through mobile phones and through iPads and so on, both to teachers and to pupils. And it will change the definition of what a teacher is, and it will change the definition. I mean, I've often thought the school is probably the most unreformed building. You think the classroom that you imagine was in the 19th century is very similar to the classroom of the 21st, so we can do something about that. But to take Sierra Leone, I mean, the president of the African Development Bank I met last week, and he was telling me in Sierra Leone, he'd talked to someone who'd just been in this village, and only one person in that village had any access to electricity, and you had all these kids in the village who were sitting outside that person's house trying to get the benefit of the electric light to do the school homework. And you know, 600 million people in Africa do not have electricity, and we've got to solve that problem there and in other parts of the world, including India, where millions of people are still without basic electricity. So we've got a long way to go to solve these basic problems of access to electricity, as well as to the chance of education. And I think we will come up with recommendations about how that might be done.
Kevin, a quick point on extractive industries.
Well, just very briefly, there's a paper that Elizabeth Steer wrote for Gordon, actually, which was presented at the Oslo Financing Summit, which highlighted the role that revenue mobilization within countries has to play in financing education. And, you know, as a minimum, even for a low-income country, you need to be raising around 20% of GDP in the form of revenue to invest in education, health, and other priorities. In a lot of Africa, that number is around 12%, 13%, 14%. So you do need to build the tax systems, and you need to stop tax evasion, especially in countries with large extractive sectors. And what that report documented was actually a systematic process of tax evasion that is probably costing Africa 3 to 4 billion annually. It's not a problem Africa can solve on its own, which is why you need the international agreement. And, you know, it's very nice that Google has now voluntarily decided to donate some taxation to the UK. But this is not an area in which voluntarism is the way you finance an education system.
I just a point. When we came into government in 1997, you will not believe this, but at that point you could claim tax relief for bribery. And it was we did change it, I can assure you.
So we'll move on to 3 more questions. First at the back, Chris.
Yeah, my name is Christopher Gunnis, and I work for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. We educate 500,000 children across the Middle East every day. My question is one of the political context in which this excellent initiative is taking place. When I meet children in Shatila camp in Beirut, when I meet them in Gaza, I meet them in Yarmouk, they say, you know, you talk about hope, and yet there is no political horizon. So in Yarmouk, they're in a shattered camp which ISIS took over on the 1st of April, and 12 of the refugee camps have been reduced to rubble.
Yep.
In Lebanon, the Palestinians are banned from over 100 professions, and in Gaza there's 44% unemployment. So when you talk about education offers hope, that would be fine if they were living in Switzerland, but the fact is they're living in places where there is no political horizon. So my question is, from a development perspective, what does it mean to have education in the absence of a political process? And as 2 former Prime Ministers, what, given that, will be your messages to the London conference about the need for political action?
And then here, and then you, the woman at the back.
Hi, my name is Augustus Della Porta. I'm a trustee of Educate a Child International. I'm also a charity lawyer working with Syrian NGOs that together support over 60 schools inside Syria. I also have relatives in Syria, including an 8-year-old niece who's never been to school, is in the besieged suburb of Yarmouk with her parents. I have just 2 questions on this. So what are the plans to try, and we talk about helping 1 million children in Lebanon, Turkey and Jordan. It's fantastic, and I can only admire from the bottom of my heart the work that you've been doing on this. What about Syria itself? What about children that are still there? What education can be provided for them? And what about therapeutic support? One of the barriers to kids, there's a report that says 30% of children from Syria are traumatized by the war. They need more than just education when they go there. Perhaps they need that before they get any education. Is there any plans to help provide therapeutic support for those children?
And at the back.
Hi, yeah, my
name
name's...
the last question.
Thank you. My name's Sophia, I'm from Ground Truth Productions. I spent the last year filming on the northern Lebanese-Syrian border. And my question, I suppose, would be to you, Mr. Gordon-Brown. Since the new visa laws were introduced in Lebanon, making it very difficult for Syrians to renew their residency permits, how does that affect children going to school, going through checkpoints and the risk of them being arrested? And also, what does that mean for their future if they're living in a country illegally? Even if they manage to graduate, what are the prospects for access to jobs?
So the questions are all sort of about hope in a way. If we could use this as an opportunity to round up the panel and answer them. Kevin, that real sort of cry from Gaza that there isn't a political settlement, there isn't hope. What do you think?
Well, I think the blockade of Gaza, which is at the heart of many of these problems, is indefensible and is a distinctive political issue. There's a broader question about the treatment of refugees. And the problem at the moment, if you look at the global appeal from UNHCR last year, I think I'm right in saying that the global appeal for refugees was around 20 billion. The actual mobilization was around 8 billion. And so essentially what is happening is countries like Ethiopia, South Sudan, Tanzania are carrying the bulk of the financing for the failure of the wider international response to the refugee problem. Whether you're talking about Afghan refugees in Pakistan would be the same type of problem. So I think there's one set of issues that these host countries need to get a better deal out of the international system. It's not a fair, it's not an equitable system. There's also, most countries have constraints on refugees working, and that is a distinctive issue. That is the last thing you want, because I think more education plus restricted access to labour markets means more educated, unemployed young people. So I think that regime does have to be changed. Interestingly, actually, some countries in sub-Saharan Africa do now allow refugees the right to work. It's a parallel debate in the United Kingdom. My own view is that a more open refugee policy would be good for the economy, good for growth. Precisely the same argument applies in many other parts of the world. There are obvious political sensitivities, especially in Lebanon, where you have such a large influx in such a short period of time. But we clearly need a regime that provides a better deal for refugees and fairer financing for host countries in the developing world.
Well, Julia, you said only education would provide hope, but of course we need more than that, don't we? And even before they get to school, this very personal appeal from Syria, therapeutic involvement. I mean, it's complex stuff, isn't it?
Yes, it is very complex stuff, and it seems to me that for a child's life you obviously want the transformative power that comes with education, but we know that there are broader development tasks that need to be undertaken in our world, and political tasks if children are then going to come out of schools and have the opportunity to participate in a need to do more. But when you think about that more, most of it is advanced by having an educated population, more capacity to see economic growth and productivity if people are educated, more capacity to negotiate differences and to find solutions to conflict, to look for peace and stability, to build institutional and government systems that can work and support people. So education isn't the solution for every problem, but it's hard to imagine a problem that isn't advantaged by having the benefits that education brings. On the very specific issue about kids who have been traumatised, there are ways of working with children, psychosocial support. There are some aid workers and educators who are very experienced in this, who can work with children and get them you know,
and are we funding them?
Dealing with trauma. Well, that's the question, and I'm certain Gordon's going to deal with that funding question and the message for the London conference. But if you've got the resources for very traumatised children, there are ways of working that get them to re-engage, and then they can make their way back through to an education path. So the need you point to is an absolutely critical one.
A very specific question from Mr. Gordon Brown about what these children do when they've left school, and which is all part of this lack of hope.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me come to that. First of all, let me applaud the Refugees Agency and what it does. I mean, it almost lost its funds this summer for work amongst the Palestinian refugees. And that would have set everything back if they and everybody else had not been able to provide the funds. And Educate a Child, the Qatar charity, does an enormous amount of work as well. So anybody who's involved in relief and in charities, I do applaud what you're doing. Psychological support. UNICEF, part of its Lost Generation program, is providing psychological support for children who are traumatized by war, and that's why we need the resources that we're talking about this evening. As far as the prospects for children and economic development, the new proposals are for economic zones in these countries, so that people who are denied the chance to work as refugees are finally given the chance to work within economic zones. It's going to be difficult, but I think it can be done. And now the World Bank is involved in Jordan and Lebanon, and I think will be involved in Turkey to create these economic zones. And that would prevent, I think, a lot of child labour, because they become the only income earners. As far as the politics, and be very brief here, the politics are concerned, I mean, the first thing is, why did the peace talks not start today? That is one way that a political process could be could deliver some hope and optimism about the future as far as the recovery of Syria is concerned. Obviously, the Palestinian settlement remains on the agenda of the international community, but it is difficult to deliver. But I wouldn't like people to go away and think that the only prospect of delivering chances or opportunities to children in these areas is through the political process. We have, even despite the failure of the political process, we have to do more for these children. We cannot leave them without the prospect that they can get an education, and as I said, without the prospect of getting a job. I was with Nelson Mandela here in London when he celebrated his 90th birthday, and we had this concert in London, and I was actually sitting next to him. I had the privilege of sitting next to him, and he went down to speak to all the artistes and the pop performers who were there, and he kept asking me who they were, and I was pretty useless because I didn't really know much about it. Anyway, he met the late, sadly late, Amy Winehouse, and she said, Mr. Mandela, she said, my husband and you have a great deal in common. And he said, yes, she said, both of you have spent a long time in prison. And but he told the story that evening. He had a picture, a facsimile of a painting in his prison cell on Robben Island. He had very, very few possessions. And for some reason he got hold of this and had it in his cell. And the painting was actually called Hope. And if you actually look at it, it's in the Victorian Albert. In fact, the guy who did it did two copies of the same picture, so there are two copies of it. But Hope is a picture where you have a young girl who is completely blindfolded, trying to play a harp with broken strings, sitting on top of a globe of the world. And it is the most desolate picture you can imagine. But as Mandela said, hope, even when the situation is hopeless, you must continue to have hope. And he, in a prison cell, who was probably never going to get out, as he thought, managed to continue to hope that something would happen. And we have to make sure that these young children, who are in the most desolate of circumstances, in the most troubled part of the world, subject to potentially violence as well as to exclusion, we must give them hope. And we cannot guarantee the political process is going to work tomorrow. And we cannot guarantee that there will be settlements across the region, the Palestinians are, but we can do something that will make a difference to these young people's lives. So while I agree with everybody who says the political process must work, we cannot allow these children to become not just a lost generation, but a discontented and dispossessed generation, with all the implications that 200 million young people growing up in the Middle East have for the security of that region and the rest of the world. We have a duty to do something to make sure that there is at least the opportunity that we can provide while the political process continues. So I would urge people here to think that we can make a breakthrough in the next few days. We can be in a position where we might be able to guarantee to every single refugee child from Syria and then across other parts of the world the right to education as well as food and shelter. And it is an endeavour which I hope you can persuade friends and colleagues is worth pursuing. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Gordon. If I could just close by saying there is a fundraiser for Syrian refugees. I think on Wednesday this week, a number of frontline members have given photographs very generously. And on the 2nd of February in St James's Church, Piccadilly, there is another fundraiser for Syrian refugees. They have currently a boat on display, which is a Syrian refugee boat that brought 62 refugees across the Greek Sea, and it's a very small and unseaworthy dinghy, which they're having to re-inflate every day so that it remains an art installation. That's on the 2nd of February. There will be an Afghan refugee telling his personal story that night, and a number of musicians playing, including Afghan musicians. That's another fundraiser for Syrian refugees, and I believe there are drinks as well.